Ya, Silvi se está conectando.
Sí, ya entró, creo.
Buenas tardes a todos.
Entonces empezamos la transmisión, guapa. ¿Ya?
No, me tocó volver a comenzar el proceso de transmisión, es lo que te decía ahora.
Que nos demoramos. Listo, entonces quedamos atentos a lo que tú digas, Sosito.
En este momento no puedo.
Un minuto.
No funciona mi cámara.
Sí, te estoy viendo.
¿Ah, sí?
Sí.
Bueno. Yo no me veo. ¿Estoy bien?
Ok, transmitiendo. Y grabando.
Buenas tardes a todos y todas los que se conectan.
Afternoon, everybody who's connected from different parts of Latin America and the world. This is the second encounter for the right to city, derecho a la ciudad, for action and transition from Colombia. Today, we have a very interesting conference. It's the second conference of this encounter, which is constituted by a group of conferences around 4 topics that we consider very important and key to the right to city. Besides, there are other meetings between American associations, Latin American associations that we have been working this topic with on. Today, we had the great opportunity to talk with Carl Hart and Raquel Horlick, which gave us a first context of the intersections, crossroads, and the new perspective we have between the drug use, stigmatization, urban planning, the reduction of harm. And today, Tuesday, December 8th, we have 2 very interesting conferences just as well. Welcome to this. This is the second conference of this meeting and the first one of the day. For this meeting, we have called up 2 people that we admire very much because of their work and who we have worked before in other congresses and events. They are Karine Carneiro and Jhon Bernal. With them, well, they are going to talk about segregation. They specifically will approach the topic of segregation. And after this, each one of them will have an intervention, and then we will have a Q&A space, questions and answers. So we want to welcome you all for the conference, Segregation of Bodies, Violence Control, and Gentrification by Karine Carneiro. And I give her a very warm welcome, Karine. Okay, good afternoon. Good afternoon, Sylvie. I'm very happy to be with you. And I also welcome you, everybody who's here. Should I start now? You should start. You shall start whenever you feel like it. Yeah. Let us remind our participants that questions will be at the end. There will be a round of questions at the end. However, you can write your questions on the chat, on the Zoom chat, all along the conference. Thank you very much and welcome. Thank you. Well, on the first place, I want to thank you, your kind invitation to participate in the second Latin American encounter on the right to city. I also want to express my gratitude and appreciation to Marcela Tovar that I had the honor of meeting a few years back when we participated in another conference on homelessness. I also thank everybody who's involved in this organization and the organization of this event. I could not, of course, fail to talk about Margarita. She's been very important in these past few days. I also take this opportunity to say hello to the people who were with us and who are with us this day today, and my partner, Jhon Bernal. I'll start my intervention talking about the big challenge of talking to you today after the beautiful conferences of yesterday's conferences. I I confess that I wondered what else can we say about the violence suffered by these populations, historically vulnerable populations that are in the streets, and they have on the streets not only their place of living and their survival, but also is the space for their construction of sociability networks, entertainment, resistance, endurance. My encounter with these people took place during my doctoral thesis. Back then, I was studying the relationship between the homeless and the production of urban spaces based on an analysis, a genealogical analysis of standards and regulations, projects, and urbanistic plans. And on the other hand, in an immersion in the city and the cities of Bogota, Horizon, with the city where I live in Brazil, very close to Rio de Janeiro, Sao Paulo, which are probably more popular. My intention was to to take a look to the urban place from bodies, people, not understanding them as problems, but as part of power, resistance, encounters, conflicts, skirmishes, exclusion, segregation, and regimes um, in everyday life. But in order to be able to contribute in those topics discussed yesterday, and not to repeat myself saying the same things, I will take into consideration that today's topic is segregation. And I propose a double investment, a double discussion. The first discussion is related to territory, with especially specifically with the right to a city. When we talk about territory, we refer to the dichotomy existing between, on the one hand, those areas that are, in quotations, rationally thought, designed, built, and supervised because they're the result of considerable knowledge, technical, scientific knowledge, and therefore they produce knowledge, information with, in quotations, the truth. Those areas have access to urban infrastructure and they welcome only the people that they consider desired, healthy, adequate. On the other hand, we saw also those other spaces or territories that, as a result of the knowledge of people, and because they don't have because they have the knowledge, because they come from the knowledge of people, they are considered incomplete, um, unhealthy, unlivable, and they're always subject to correction, but not all the time. Correction normally occurs when there's a major interest, when it's by reason of a major interest. If we mention Pierre Cardot and Christian Lapage, sorry, which are both French philosophers, they understand this new reason as neoliberalism, which is taking over all dimensions of life. So with this discussion, what I intend is to rethink the body, the human body as a territory, talk about territory and about a body territory. Okay, the second discussion is related to violence, because in general, this second kind of territory, the last ones I mentioned, the latter, the popular territories are considered as the place for violence, of illegality, crime, dishonesty. Even more, if we center our attention in statistics, we would be very easily convinced that this is the truth. There is a coincidence between violence in those territories. Therefore, I ask, what if we think of those places as targets of violence, places where violence strikes? It produces a series of many other types of violence. And apparently, those two discussions are complementary, and my intention is to start a discussion on them. I want to take the opportunity of this space that's been given to me to rethink and talk about new ways of confronting the historical violence that, as newcomers, Europeans, whites were entering our lands, heterosexual people, Christians, and mainly landowners. Let's start as the body as the first territory to be colonized, as it would be impossible to colonize the physical space or the physical territory without colonizing and covering the other one. Okay, the coverage done by the colonization of knowledge and the colonization of being. Here I allow myself a very historical leap, a leaping time from the 16th century to the 21st century, but this is an epistemological leap. As Marcela said before, this violence is constant and it's present along these vast centuries. Then this leap is therefore invoking the understanding of the massacres, murders of blacks and Indians, but also of women, homosexuals, transsexuals, and many others considered as abnormal, queer. And that, okay, and that exterminium is not only physical, it's also existential. This one is done from formatting the body territory through the incidence of mechanisms, tactics of powers and knowledge. The calculations done within the environment of what Michel Foucault conceptualized as biopolitics, that is to say, the power over life and over the body of a species. But through the governability, and conducting the conduct of those bodies makes them live and being left to die. That is a double consequence of biopolitics or biopolicies. It also causes a particular society to live and survive, and the other one is left to die in the defense of the former. And I will ask your permission to quote some subtracts from Michel Foucault, from Michel Foucault's work. And I quote, "We must maximize the positive elements to be able to transit the best way possible and minimize, on the other hand, what is risk and inconvenience as theft, disease, knowing that they will never be repressed. What we're going to look for to structure these plans is elements that will make them multifunctional. What is a good street? It's a street that, of course, will have transit of miasmas, just like disease. And it will be necessary to manage or administer the street in this, okay, in this scenario, undesirable but necessary. The street will be that one where merchandise will be carried, transported, there will be storefronts, uh, thieves will be able to transit on it, and people looting, etc., or rioting. These are all the different functions of a city. Some of them are positive, some of them are considered negative, but they are to be implemented in this planification. Definitely, we will work with the future. The city will not be conceived or planned according to the static perception, according to a static perception that will guarantee the functionality of the perception. That's what Michel Foucault said. On the other hand, it is planified to locate in the colonized territory the territory bodies that are not completely colonized, but in a certain way are useful. And I will specifically return to this term, useful bodies, later on. I would like to mention another quote from Foucault, another Foucault quote that talks about positioning more specifically, of the positioning of bodies, one in relation to the others, to the rest. The problem of the place or positioning, okay, is set out to men as a topography problem. And this is not simply a matter of will there be enough space for humankind in the future, a problem which is, of course, very important. But it's also the problem of knowing what relations of vicinity, what kind of storage, circulation, peaceful pacification must be maintained in which situation in order to attain each or which purpose. We're at a moment, we're going through a moment that we're being offered a space to discuss this. Then, Foucault is referring to how those mechanisms act on the place, on the spaces that I consider territories to conform groups that are considered ideal. And so thus he makes a distinction between a theoretical frame and a practical framework. On the theoretical framework, he considers that whatever encouraged that change in positioning was the profanity, the theoretical profanity of territory. However, from a practical perspective, okay, making things sacred still prevails and is responsible for keeping inconvenient positions based on the conduct of the bodies. And now I quote Foucault for the last time. I think that today's preoccupation is fundamentally space. And we can understand how it is space. In contemporary space, well, it's still not completely profaned. There was certain profanity of the space, theoretically speaking, provoked by Galileo's work, but we still have not gotten to a practical profanity of space. And maybe all of our lives still directed by a series of superstitions that cannot be touched, which are institution and practice. Institution and practice have not dared to attack. They're positions that we take for granted. For example, between public and private space, social and public space, cultural and useful space, between working space and practical space. All of them move by a sacralization, a secret sacralization, something that we are not intending to change completely. In this sense, I propose that what is sacred that which cannot be touched is the movement of a Eurocentrical vision, colonizing vision, and anti-natural of what the private property, family, culture, and work is the maintenance of a territory colonization from the colonization of bodies as a way to keep that colonization. The body owning other bodies and territories is also the body organizing from a family structured in a heterosexual family and a patriarchy. It's also a body molded within a pattern of behavior and aesthetic that are completely Europe-centered, Eurocentrical. It, it keeps the concept of a capitalistic world and neoliberal world. This is clear that completely downgrades the territory, doesn't completely downgrade the territory body because it resists. And I will come back to this topic later on so that we're not left with a sensation of non-mobility or paralysis. Actually, I believe that Jhon Bernal, who will speak about art, policies, music, and concrete walls, he will show us the roots to escape and the need to transform these escape mechanisms in another system world. I don't know if I'm correct about this, if I'm right, but now I go back to the previous claim, which is territory bodies not completely colonized are somehow useful for the capitalistic world system. And to illustrate this, to show this, I return to my thesis. More specifically, I will refer back to two justifications that were made to proceed to requalify urban qualifications. One of them in Bogota, another one in Belo Horizonte. The first one is by an architect from the Division of Architectural Renovation of the District of Bogota, performed 2014 when the urban renewal plan was presented. This is an area that little by little has been getting lost in the city. It has been taken over by the homeless that are there from 6 o'clock on, 6 p.m. on. People do not transit these areas because they're afraid of their safety, for their safety. So this will improve safety. Urban zones will recover a sector that is strategically located. So I move on to the second claim, the second statement, which is made by an architect from the Council of okay, Heritage in 2013. It's about a project that had the purpose of uh, construct pipes, dog pipes under the street. This Santa Teresa pipeline is in the Belo Horizonte central area, is completely abandoned, dirty, and struck by weather and misused by citizens. Presently, it's become a shelter for homeless. This is a very interesting place for Belo Horizonte municipality because it represents a fundamental part in the process of improvement and revitalization of urban spaces and public places, which are presently downgraded and not appropriately used by the population. So I ask, I wonder, what do these two lines have, what do these two lines have in common? This strata that I mentioned before tell us that the places that have been targeted for violence are usually described as sordid with high crime rates, violence, and they're downtrodden and destroyed, slummy. In this scenario, the homeless people have been singled out as the responsible ones, along with other body territories, territory bodies like prostitutes, vendors, recyclers, dealers, drug dealers, because of the misuse of the space. Uh, and they have been blamed for the physical deterioration of these places. They have been singled out as a reason for urban disorder and unsafety. And they're, they have been responsible for isolating the good citizens which make good use of the territory. These are the bodies of insecurity, sorry, unsafety and danger. These territory bodies are considered dangerous. Amongst the many other justifications similar to this, I could prove in my thesis that the presence of these people was there merely pragmatically as a result of their ongoing urbanistic renewal and reorganization in both cities. So we need to reorganize the cities uh, based on policies that take humans as the key point for reurbanization. Bodies have been used to justify the speech in favor of interventions in the territory. How else could we fundament the mega projects of urban renewal, urban renovation, and to provide rebirth for downtown? How could we do all of this if these body territories did not exist? They have been assigned the responsibility for unsafety crime, and they are very useful for the real estate market. They have become an important part to guarantee the expansion of markets in urban spaces, mainly through, sorry, mainly through new combinations and alliances between the state and capital. It's a part of a strategy of neoliberal governability and produced through mechanisms and disciplinary strategies and biopolitical strategies, bodies and territories that are considered, uh, let's say, defective, have been used by the city to perpetuate themselves of this model of a city under the aspect of constant renovation of territory. It is precisely at this point that I could observe that the spaces mainly used for the concentration of these bodies were not merely taken by this population, they were abandoned so as to become territories that have received populations that have been historically vulneralized or attacked. In that case, all the actions by the local public powers um, have not done anything to for the historical debt that there is with these bodies. They continue to take over of the spaces inhabited by them, and it's an opportunity for the elites that control the urban spaces go on with their processes of homogenization and entrepreneurial transformation in the urban tissue. And so they keep their colonization. The urban space then is downgraded and its surroundings are as well. They can be sold by very low prices and transitions. These transitions in the long term yield actually really good financial earnings. These body territories pass from being understood as a problem of the city and their territories, but also as part of the logic of the destructive logic of urban and economic spaces. Therefore, they become useful bodies and just as old as the story of those urban areas. In that sense, these bodies, territories that are not docile, since they are structured in other structures of behavior and sociability, they have been pushed and forced into even more peripheral areas. So they're being segregated, and now they are forming what was referred to as gentrification. But in order to prepare for my presentation today, and after these pandemics, I have observed that the increase in violence against women, against Black African descendants, many of them children, here in Brazil, in 2020, we've had 20 Black children murdered in favelas, Rio de Janeiro. So, such violence against those bodies has increased a lot. And therefore, because of that, I started wondering if segregation categories and the gentrification categories are enough to understand the situation. And from only the concept of biopolitics, and which is live and let die. Therefore, I conclude the first discussion using the body as a territory. And now we'll move on to the second point that I want to make today. As popular territories, not as a place where violence is originated, but as territories that are targeted by violence. And as the last aspect of violence, which is the death of the physical body, the death of the physical body. I'm doing this because it's important to point out that in present days, biopolitics is not confronting the problem of life and death. Mm, What we are witnessing, even more constantly, is that not that we let people live and let them die, but we're now watching that people are led to die, left to die, which has been qualified as necropolitics. And to explore this topic, and thus I will end my presentation, part of the contrast between biopolitics and necropolitics by a Brazilian psychologist, professor of psychology called Eugene Ilarium. I was with him in a Facebook Live with Leonel. It was conducted during this pandemic, carried out during this pandemic, and on that Facebook Live, he told us that biopolitics, as explained by Foucault, establishes power on life, power that manages life, supervises, controls life, and produces subjectivities in this production of life. But this sense of administration of the bodies is done in defense of a certain types of society, something that I had mentioned before earlier. But here there is no doubt that we're talking about to the Eurocentric model. The European model is the one that's placed as the protected model. And that correlation between letting die and making others live, but also the power of death, has its own sense to produce this type of living. I explain myself with Leonid's comments. I quote, "Today, ever more bodies are not subjected to the corrective normalization because they are disposable. In other words, biopolitics is a method to manage societies, and the correlation is fundamentals to the richness, to the wealth of societies, and part of the consolidation process of capitalism. So biopolitics leads to the creation of a healthy population with useful bodies and docile bodies. But to sum it up, biopolitics presents another problem. How are we going to administer all of this when the capitalistic system doesn't need them, when they cannot all fit the capitalistic model? So there's no more space for everyone because the capitalistic machinery has to be expanded uncontrollably over the territory. So the question arising is, if the 21st century, how will we promote the welfare for the people whose lives has no value, who are considered superfluous? And the answer, I believe, can be found when we consider the exercise of necropolitics, or the practice of necropolitics, which is to let die, which was already a characteristic of biopolitics, but even more serious, to make other people die. This is the scenario that is considered within a context of capitalistic crisis, and this death is not the consequence of a permanent state of internal violence in the peripheral areas and in the poverty areas. This death is in fact a consequence of the violent actions of the state, of the capitalistic state in the peripheral areas and poverty areas, and of the expansion of their frontiers. And to, for example, I can mention mining, industry. It's important to point out this aspect so that we can rethink new strategies and methods for interaction and resistance against this necropolitical system that has death as its first goal and meaning. The daily production of bodies or territories that can be murdered. We have witnessed the deepening of a segregation process. I understand that this segregation process has never stopped, but we have been experiencing in Latin America is a process of massacring populations. And now, moving on to the end of my conference, I quote Leonid's last speech. also understanding necropolitics as a social affectionate process of building affections in the social tissue and trying to make this destruction, trying to assume this destruction by the people. This is called physical adherence or physical attachment to violence. People who lived through barbaric events with no access to education, health, um, and wealth. And this is something that people yesterday also spoke about very much. Those people who live like that, those subjects, live in an immense frustration. And necropolitics acts on that direction and creating that bad situation through capitalism. So this permanent situation of frustration, they try to present that it's not a crisis of capitalism, but the result of a group, a corrupt group that took over power, and therefore we must take them out of there. But after eliminating corruption, then we need to get rid of feminists, transsexuals, homosexuals, the homeless, and so on. The problem then is not because of the strategies of capital, since capitalism is perfect. The problem is manifested through the bad behavior of some populational groups. These groups that have death as a physical and symbolic horizon and end. The moral and political crisis of capitalism are then the reason of those, sorry, are the responsibility of those groups which must be annihilated. So this politics produces docile bodies and totalitarian institutions and policies that produce lifeless bodies. Maybe my presentation has taken on a terrifying dimension, but I frequently think that fear makes us react and act so as to avoid, for example, other women, other lesbian women to suffer, to undergo the same situation that happened to Maria Lefranco. She was a black lesbian councilwoman, congresswoman, murdered in Rio de Janeiro because of her work in favelas and because of her fight for a right to the city. So it's important to cite her name because Marielle's death completes today 1,000 days with no results whatsoever in the investigation as to who murdered her. So we have to get out of the closet and put our bodies on the line so that police officers do not continue murdering Black, African descendants, indigenous, aboriginals, homeless, homosexuals. We have to be more than xenophobes. Okay. We have to be against sexism, against xenophobia. We have to move on from theory to practice because that's the only way it would be possible to colonize Latin American territories without colonizing their bodies. And it's not possible to talk about the right to city without talking about the right to life and to your own body. That's what I brought today to talk to you. And hopefully we will be able to expand on these subjects. Thank you very much for the invitation to be here.
Ok, gracias a ti, Karine, por tu,
Thank you, Karim,
espérame un segundo, ya, por tu
for your
ponencia. Realmente
for your
lo que habla
discussion,
sobre
for
el
your
escenario
intervention.
negativo, pues
The
es
negative scenario that you're describing
complicado
is a little bit
y
complicated
la realidad es muy
because
fuerte
it's a very strong reality, very
y
harsh
tenemos
reality,
pocas posibilidades de salir de
and
ellos si
very
seguimos
few
en esa misma
possibilities are
situación,
visible, are
¿cierto?
visualized
Y
to
yo
be able
también
to get out
creo
of
que
that
es importante
situation. So I
que lo
completely agree
importante
with you.
de estos espacios
But
es
the
que
most important
pasemos del
aspect of
pensamiento y de
these
la teoría
conversations is to move from theory to action. And actually, the most important thing that each one of us can do is to activate in our own worlds, in our own systems, in our own social circles, the same button. Because if we want to fix the world from our governments, it's going to be impossible. So these reflections and these debates are just as important because of this reason. It arises some doubts, but right now we need to make room for Jhon. Later on, we can discuss all the doubts that have been generated or that have arisen after this intervention. Thank you again, Karine. It was very interesting. There are many things that, in particular, I had not thought about because you're always probably isolated from reality, from other realities, other people's realities. So when you get to see that in an area there's an urbanistic process that's going to make the city more beautiful, we always see it as something positive. But this makes me realize that we need to be able to balance those two aspects. Of course, we should not be stuck in the past, and cities need to be urbanistically developed. But these urbanistic developments should not be paid for with such a high price by these communities that are being forced out of their territories. And so this is something to reflect on, and we will debate about this at the end. Thank you, Karine. Now, leaving the floor for Jhon. If okay, probably some of you recognize him because he was the tour guide in downtown Bogota in 2018. Good afternoon for everybody. After walking through the locality, through the location of Los Mártires, I clarify, despite the fact that what's legitimizing that, sorry, because I have a tour guide ID, that's not the only thing that authorizes me to walk the territory. Now, I'm also a citizen that can move through space and territory. That's how I want to start my presentation. Yes. I need to articulate my presentation with Karine's. She was talking about body and territory, of course, without separating one from the other. Okay, the territory as a body too. And the body territory is violated. In the case of martyrs, de los mártires, this neighborhood, maybe in other places there are some of this is not being already established, but when a whole block of houses in neighborhood is disappeared and people are forced out of it, then territory has been violated. Then we need to look for other alternatives so that something can be done about the other spaces that remain. But those spaces are no longer there. People who were the inhabitants of those spaces are now in the peripheral areas that doesn't exist now. For those of you who know Bogota, for those of you who don't, well, Google knows everything. And I will put it in these terms of art with chords of lyrics from 1925 when these people from the colonization, from the colony said, okay, no more burials in the church atriums. Governor Spalletta in 1825 prohibited religious practice of burying bodies in churches. So Domingo Schiacchi designed the cemetery, the central cemetery, to establish that as a place where nobody wanted to be there later. Now, why do I talk about this? Because the cemetery, if you Google it later, for those of you who don't know it, okay, it's divided now. It's an elliptical figure that is now divided into globe A, globe B, globe C. And globe C is apparently where all the tombs of the people who were not people who didn't have names and homeless were placed there. People who died in the Bogotazo revolution, and now it's destined. Okay, they have destined this area for a park. They're going to build a park in this area, and they want to create like an artistic symbol of Botero. If you're coming from the airport when you get to Bogota, you will see a huge Botero. In that globe sea space, we will find this Botero structure. And then in the year 2000, we were working with a theater group, making recognition of the territory, learning what the theater was about because we didn't actually know how to do theater, but we got into it because it was a tool. It was a practical tool to use the free time of the children of these populations, these vulnerable populations. So we started finding out, doing research about this, Los Mártires, this neighborhood. So our interest grew. And then we created another group called the begging because we had to beg a lot for people to get to that space. And on those works that, sorry, on those plays, one of those plays that we did, we said instead of graves, we had a botero. I want to begin the story with this because this botero turned out to be more important than what had happened in that place. It was the memory of the city. This is when you start to say, when you start doing the job, and by you, I mean youngsters, people who were in the theater group, we started doing this research and we began with the monuments and then the Los Mártires, the Central Cemetery, the obelisk, everything. But after that concrete, there were many people. After all those concrete structures, there were people buried and other richer aspects. And that was probably the wealth of that sector. So we stopped talking about dates and that these monuments were built in this century. Of course, there are beautiful architectural monuments that make the city beautiful, but at the same time, they harbor those marginalized populations that come to live to the center of the city. That's why I use this term peripheral. But in this case, the periphery that I mean is not a physical space. The periphery that I'm talking about is an economic space. It's a place, okay, that defines people who have no resources because they are vendors, because they work downtown without taking a bus, because the bus takes 5,000 pesos from them or 2 hours from their time so that they can work, they can do their jobs. So it's here in Mártires, in this neighborhood, where we have all the vendors, all the homeless people. We have the marketplaces. We have the origins of Bogota. We had 7 marketplaces that were taken in to other places of the city. And all of this through the Savannah station that originated the commerce in this space. It's necessary to talk about this so that we're clear on the space of this, we're clear on the spatial aspect of this topic. Los Mártires harbors all of these populations, is home to all of these populations, these bodies. Mártires, out of 20 neighborhoods that Bogota has, this is the one that has all the social problems that there are. And it also has the budgetal challenges, main budgetal challenges, but still, you got all the programs, traffic, micro traffic, drug addiction, homelessness, aboriginal homeless people coming to the city. And so this place, well, harbors everything. It can fit anyone and everything. Okay, this was a long introduction. Well, so my point is arts, policies, people, and concrete walls, concrete structures. I'm going to share my screen so that I can illustrate some of what I say. Please give me a moment. So when I talk about that physical space that can fit anyone or anything, okay, can you tell me if you can already see my screen,
No, John, aún
please?
no.
No, we cannot view it. Not yet. Wait, here it goes. So here we have. Well, this is gonna seem a little funny. It says people, personas, but and concrete structures, art, policies, people, and concrete structures. These are the basic terms of art as a expression from anywhere in the world. Okay. Politics as the basis of human organization, as everybody under a state. People as individuals from a space, belonging to a space, and who are subject to rights and duties, which determine this order, and the concrete structures, which is the connection to Karine, to Karine's discussion, which is the urban development plan, the urban buildings. Okay, is the group of actions of the state that have as a goal to implement an occupation or an organized occupation of the livable state, occupiable state. So this is necessary, and its first action should be on San Victorino, the neighborhood San Victorino on the locality of Santa Fe. Google knows everything. He's giving me that information, this spatial information of San Victorino. It was between the 10th Street and Caracas, between the 11th and 12th Avenues, but now it's more of a increased space because of that um, territorial organization plan. There we had the Nariño Gallery, what was like the popular marketplace gallery where anything could be sold. And now this is the first place that was forced out, was displaced. So they started to talk about the public space. The public space is for everyone. So we clean out these areas, we force these people out, and we leave a huge park for in Plaza España, where you had all the marketplaces previously, all the vendors. And in the case of San Victorino, there is a big park with a big symbol, the Negret's butterfly. And this is where I start to mention art. Art turns out being an invisible aspect that is being used by these people who are in power to transform spaces, to change spaces. Invisibly, they are conducting us and leading us and telling us that, in fact, the artist's song, the artist's work, that they are actually legitimating the space with artists' work, with people's work. But it's also fit to say that behind this, there is another problem, which is, well, there is another situation, which is the orange economy coming from these orders from the World Bank and neoliberalism. So we put this on the stand, put it on the table so that everything looks pretty, and we talk about economic balance, and that we talk about adequate spaces for everyone. However, without planning, and without those plans being established for the people. Those plans are established for those who legislate. That's the role of the word politics in my presentation. So the word politics allows us to legislate for those who have the buying power, who have the money. Those are the ones who choose all our governors or politicians, and they decide what's going to be done in our territories. And those governmental machineries are the ones that establish the political leaders. Well, they're the ones who, in the end, decide how the city will be, how the urban areas will be renovated. So in the case of that connection, for those of you who know Bogota, so they connect, they make a connection between Santa Fe and Candelaria and Martires through a corridor that is called the Bronx Corridor. But all of this establishing in the middle the dynamics of industrial policies in the middle, amidst everything, where the old Bronx used to be. So we forced the Bronx out of this area because now anything can be done there. But since Cinderella is always the art is always Cinderella because we give an economic value to it, and we give an economic value to that intellectual creation, and we put it there with other city orders, then it becomes the aspect that transform or changes that space. So we're going to establish in that space a new center, the epicenter of orange economy in Bogota. That's where the Gran Cena will take place. That's an educational institution in Colombia. And there will be other artistic practices through video games and audiovisual arts, but mostly we're going to make the connection with the movie act, the movie law, late 8/14 of 2003. And we amended with a law from 2017 where it is stated that the previous president, Santos, says it is time to start making movies in Colombia. All of this to establish the fact that we already have the legislation, we already have the space, we already have SENA, the Educational Institute, and so we have the working crew ready for foreign people to come and make movies in our country. And then we start selling Bogota as a capital of services, services rendered. And all of that added to the concept of the city that we all want, and Martires, of the recovery of Martires and all of those neighborhoods, which lead to the airport, or the two avenues that are Caracas and the 10th Avenue, where we have this area that I have described. All of this is meant to say that we actually forced our marginalized population out of their own space. They can no longer be there, not even the vendors, who, by the way, have nowhere else to live. We don't have the homeless, in quotations, the homeless, because there is no public policy that works in favor of them, that makes them legitimate in other places or allows them to stay in other places. We need for policies, clear policies to be established on this, but we don't have adequate policies. But us, we're creating an aseptic city, a clean city, and we're building on the key areas of the city we're building. Then the word gentrification takes place in all of these urban corridors. Okay, now Las Cruces, El Bronx, La Favorita, and on the north, well, there's a there's a pact of tolerance, the ill-named tolerance pact, and now we start talking about redlining, red district. Then we tried all these models of necropolitics, and we bring them into these areas. So aquí in Santa Fe is a connector between the other areas, localities. So we're going to have the connection to those important buildings that are being built right now, like Atrium, amongst other big spaces. And then there's the big real estate speculation on this area. Sorry, it doesn't start, it's going on, continues. All of this to be able to say or to get to the same conclusion without quoting the authors that Karine was quoting previously. All of this leads to gentrification, necropolitics, how we manipulate people to establish who will be the ones who will govern. Well, already spoke about the movie act. Well, the violated territory. I believe that I'm going to stop right there with that topic so that we can start taking questions. In one of the texts that Paolo Viñolo from National University did, in one of the spaces where people gathered, people from those natural populations, inhabitants of Mártires and Santa Fe, the natural inhabitants of Mártires and Santa Fe, the trans population in Santa Fe, and in the cemetery, someday I wrote something that art does not have to, um, art does not must not hit people. It must work to be able to transfer spaces. There's a word that was said here earlier, and it's revitalization. But this word is part of this necropolitical order and this gentrificational order, and I would change it by the word reivindication. Because if I'm vindicating the people, I'm actually helping them. Okay, sir, I would prefer the use of the word the vindication of the area for the people, and to make that wake up call and to raise these questions. Who are our politicians? Who govern us? Who do they govern for? Who do they write policy for? And who are the real inhabitants of this space? I'm not sure if this is the right term, but actually, what we do is not doesn't make a big effect, doesn't cause a big effect, because we're only a group of people. If we don't get to transform these realities, this is an illustration done by one of our group members, and he wanted to illustrate what happened in Manzana 13, a gentrification process, because Bronx, as well as it may be today, the authors of the territory, it's been transformed. They already had their way in the Bronx. We have been displaced from this space, and that's what will continue to happen. That's what he wanted to illustrate with this drawing. And with this picture, when I talk about these people, I talk about these areas with an S from a money sign. That's why I use money sign for the word people, because they are, sorry, the plan for ordinance and protection that it was designed by architects and people who perform or who design those plans without taking these people into consideration. There has been transformation and change, but not enough yet. In the case of this marketplace in San Fermin, which is one of the most important in the country for selling herbs, it's been the victim of privatization. These marketplaces were established under, okay, they were established under the premises of cleanness, healthiness, but now they're being taken as something different because what we're doing is classifying them in international parameters, patterns, and the topic is this public investment that we're making working? So if it's not, then we privatize them and we hand it to other people. That's why I bring up the example of the marketplace. This is happening all over the world, and it's part of this transformation scenario. All of these spaces, as the previous speaker said before, have to be transformed, yes, but not at the stake of people, not at the expense, sorry, not at the expense of the population, not at the expense of its natural inhabitants. So if we cannot establish those policies and mechanisms to prevent this from happening, well, I really hope that these spaces like this generate this change, these reflections. Here I'm showing you Plaza España because There's absolutely nothing from the space. It was trees before. Now we have only concrete and cement with different dynamics. We're talking, of course, about the restaurant corridor. We're talking about other things. We don't have now the secondhand clothes stores who were there, the vendors who were there. They were forced out of there and they were not protected. More than 100 of them were forced out. I'm talking about them so as to contextualize them for those of you who don't know the situation, who are not familiar with the situation. It generated an economy over recycling clothes. They generated this, and they provided an opportunity for other people with less buying power to buy a garment. So basically, we recycled garments. They had a financial support, these vendors, the secondhand vendors, but these 269 people who were organized there were forced out of there. And this was one of the most important processes in the city when it happened. But basically, they put together 1,000 pesos daily so that they could complete 1,000 millions, a billion pesos, so that they could move to San Victorino. Okay. Okay, they are disappearing right now because they were not protected. So the second-hand vendors disappeared as a victim of this process. All of this leads us to the conclusion of segregation, um, practiced by the state and from their own governability practices. And as society, we're also segregated and marginalized because also the word it could be that we're used, but anyway, we're taken to the limit. We're worn off so as to legitimate their own intentions and their own projects, and our efforts are never enough. And this scream that the communities who inhabit these places can be included in these policies and in their processes, but this never happens. So we simply end up being subject of that segregation from the perspective of our participation. And in the case of the homeless and vendors and people who are placed there, vendors, they must be forced out and they must go because the money will not be enough for them to pay for their housing. After this transformation, now they cannot pay for their new housing prices because it's now a neighborhood for entertainment and orange economy. Because here where speculations were established, urbanistic speculation was established. So a house used to cost 2 million pesos, 200 million pesos, and now it's 2 billion pesos. So in that sense, as the authors of all of those spaces, we end up being segregated, marginalized, excluded. So I'm not sure if we should open a space for a debate or if you have some concrete questions on this matter and we can answer them as they arise. John, thank you very much. Your discussion was very interesting, your intervention. I think it's fantastic that you brought up the topic of art in different countries. It has been so very commonly mentioned that the United States has the term art washing, which is to take these places and become, turn them into art districts. But actually, in reality, art is restricted to two or three galleries. And what they do is that they do some real estate speculation on the prices and they increase so much the price of soil, square footage of properties. Real estate prices go up high, and these legitimates exclusion and segregation. And the people who actually inhabited those places before are forced out. And I would like to point out that this year I was very surprised when I saw the virtual Bronx since since Bronx underwent this process of art washing and that orange economy that was going to be transformed into a cultural space, and then the natural inhabitants were forced out. And since this could not take place because of pandemics this year, so they actually set up the virtual Bronx, and they were selling the spaces on the gallery so that people would exhibit their work in virtual galleries. So whoever, but all these communities were the ones who made this area important are excluded from these events. And this is an element that was not very um, present, very noticeable. And now that you've mentioned it, thank you for mentioning it. Now it's more noticeable. And some tools that were now, that before were in the hands of artists are now have now become the tool of the system to displace the people in these communities. So we're surprised, we're shocked because oh my God, these people shoot from all areas, from all flanks. So those processes of uh, transforming a neighborhood into a restaurant neighborhood and decorate and etc. And for example, making dishes gourmet. So everything is lost. All the identity that had been built in that area is lost. So I think that's why I think what you're bringing up is very interesting. I really thank you so much for this conference. There's something very interesting. And yes, we're going to provide room for questions, also for the opinions and interventions for people, sorry, the people's opinions and interventions, participants' opinions and interventions. We can debate, all of us can debate in these conferences, in these rooms. So I want to invite everyone, encourage everyone not only to participate, but also to expose, propose their own viewpoints and whatever they want to share around this topic, segregation. However, there are a few questions that have already been specified. Marcela is asking for Jhon, how do we generate resistant processes from the territories? Complicated, complicated because if you build resistant processes from art, but now art is has been in the middle of this process like that, it's manipulated now. Since the participation, it's being manipulated. And with this participation, we come to sorry, a wearing off. So now we need other kind of resistance screens because from these sceneries, it's really complex and difficult. Because also the police code has been changed. So now we cannot rally, we cannot march. So we need to legitimate the rally with a policy. So if you make art, it's bad. If you march, it's bad. So there are so many things that we cannot change, that we cannot transform up to this point. For example, in the case of Manzana, I was talking to them yesterday. Um, one can be sometimes be very prejudiced, and in that sense, I've learned to establish dialogues, right? And establish those constructions because people who are there with this function that they have to do this, but we're told to do this, and then we start making our own decisions. But my position was, okay, do all the art, all the works with the people who are natural to the territory, with the territory inhabitants. If you're going to establish policies, then please legitimate them in the territory. Legitimate them with the reality of the territory, not with the multinational companies, not with industrialization or landowners. Okay? That was the invitation that I was doing. So, well, let's lower the tune. Let's speak into a more friendly tune. And I used to tell them this like that, but please, let's not wear the people off because people lose their lives in this fight. Thank you, John. I don't know if Karine wants to make a contribution regarding this question of how to generate resistant processes. I also have a question for you, Karine. Do you consider that we can also talk about gentrification in cases like the Bronx in Bogota, where it wasn't really the real estate market, it wasn't the construction market that displaced, but it was directly the state, our government? Can we call that gentrification? Okay, very well. Well, before I answer the question, which was asked directly to me, I would like to to say something about the resistant processes because I think they are in our everyday lives. And the recusation of continuing with the education of subjects with processes of subjectification uh, in favor of neoliberalism. That's why I mentioned the neoliberal reasons, because currently neoliberalism doesn't only control financial economy. It is a production of subjects, of entrepreneurs themselves per se. So there are no more working men, there are no employees. Everybody's an entrepreneur. We're all co-participants of a big company. So to resist would be to resisting being that neoliberal subject, because if we resist initially as a body, then we can resist in the territory. But this is harder because we are every day bombed with publicity, advertising, marketing, which portrays art, misportrays art, as Jhon explained. Here in Brazil, in terms of territorial resistance, we have direct action of occupation. So mainly in Sao Paulo, when big areas are hygiened or cleaned for the entrance of capital, many of them, many of those buildings, many properties remain empty and vacant for a long time. So there are groups like the DSP, which are dwellers, roofless dwellers, and they inhabit these spaces. They transform them in rooms. So we have a big number of properties, vacant buildings that are now occupied today, okay, because of the right to the social function of properties. Understanding property not as an only dimension or expression of possession. Okay. Possession makes sense if it complies with a social purpose. And this is what legitimates people to occupy these properties. But this is not possible without state violence, police violence, but people are resisting. As to Marcela's question, in the processes as the Bronx, what we have is the state acting on behalf of the companies. Indirectly, what we have is the big real estate capital, like behind the scenes, taking over everything. And that's why I spoke about neoliberalism, because it's many times understood as a liberalization of the market, the release of the market, and the withdrawal of public power. But it's actually the opposite. It's not a weak state. Neoliberalism depends on an exceptionally strong state to be able to transform what was public, what belonged to everyone, into a private space. So basically, it's like the state uh, provides its face to hide the real people behind this. Hotels, convention centers, art galleries. So, so as much as the state, as a direct action is performed by the state, it's all on behalf or in the interests of some private capital, which is usually entrepreneurial capital. Thank you so much. Very interesting. What you bring up is very interesting. The roofless dwellers has really caught my attention because I have noticed that it has been able to legitimate what you mentioned before, this real social function of a space, the real social purpose of a space. That we don't have to live convinced under the conviction that if this building belongs to one person, then it can never be inhabited, even if it's, as we say in Colombia, a white elephant that's been there without being inhabited. So I think in those terms, the Brazilian experience enriches the Colombian experience a lot because we don't have those movements here in Colombia. We don't have an organized movement. And it would be very interesting in the future, with the connection that we have already established with you and with Jhon, to start seeing how we can create a new strategy of transformation and connections, networking, to start exercising that right and to communicate to people the importance of exercising and demanding that right. That buildings and properties, they have a public purpose, a social purpose, and if they're not complying with that social purpose, they make no sense. And then it's very interesting that they are inhabited. If they're going to be demolished, well, when they're going to be demolished, we'll talk about it. But if it's not going to happen anytime soon, let them be inhabited. They have a social purpose in places, for example, in like Bogota, where our temperature at night um, can drop to zero or below. So they have a very important social purpose, and it's very interesting to talk about this, and it's very interesting for you to bring it up. And also the connection that you're doing to entrepreneurship, because this present condition that they're transforming us all into managers and CEOs of our own companies. And I have been struggling with this for a long time. And now it turns out that if you're not sustainable, then you don't deserve your cultural expression, or your cultural expression does not deserve to exist because it's not self-sustainable. And then I was thinking, for example, of hospitals. Hospitals are not for profits. Hospitals are for health, for curing people, not for profit purposes. So in the art, it's not always to profit, to make profit. Sometimes it's simply to transmit, to communicate, to represent reality, to expose, to denounce. But that neoliberalism that you're talking about, change medicine into a for-profit occupation. Um, they have transformed us for clients to users, and every time, okay, they have transformed us from patients to users or clients. And now, in that sense, they're denying us of our treatments. And for example, if we have heart disease, okay, they can deny our treatment, treating it as a product. Those are the things of neoliberalism. And it's very interesting to connect the body, the territory, resistance, art, entrepreneurship, orange economy. And that is how we are actually peeling off the fruit. And now we realize that everything is all the same segregation policy. It's all part of the same manipulation, segregation policy, the reduction of our skills as individuals, to prevent us from demanding our rights. So for me, a whole new panorama has been opened, a whole new outlook with your vision, with Karine's vision and Jhon's vision. So I think that for the exercise of this second encounter, this second Congress, it's very important and very interesting to see how these two concepts have interlaced and entwined. Because we also need to see how we can confront the situation and how we can resist this from this group. Because now we realize that it's very important. And I think it's fantastic because it legitimates these fights, these struggles that we are going through. Okay, Patricia from Casa del Centro says, thank you very much, Jhon and Karine, for this encounter. She also says, Tijuana is the medical tourism model. We have that medical tourism model, and they're super proud. Only one public hospital for more than 2 million inhabitants, and private things above everything else. Yes, health has also become a business, a market. So I want to take this opportunity to also say hello to the people who are connected from Los Mártires, because it's very important to bring here all the voices. Inda Lozano is connected, and also Diana del Pilar. Very interesting because there are people who are there within the territory, working within the territory. So we actually thank you very much. Thank you very much for connecting, for logging in. And I would also love to hear, to listen to his point of view, since this is a topic that we are working on, but I believe he's not connected anymore. I don't know if any of the attendants at this point wants to make a contribution, make a comment. The room is open for your comments. There is another question. Sorry, I hadn't seen it. What Karine calls bodies territories can be understood as homo sacer, under the logic of being disposed of because they're neither men nor beast. Homo sacer in terms of agamben, that is to say, I don't know exactly. Uh, I don't know exactly the sacer de agamben. It's not anymore a matter of being disposable. What I think we're dealing with is that we're facing exterminium. Okay. And is the exercise of necropolitics, of killing. There's no room for everybody anymore. In the neoliberal world, there's no room for everybody anymore because frontiers are expanded. And just to give you an example, I work directly with people who have been forced out of their territories by the big um, climate disasters. Oh, sorry, no, disasters, environmental disasters as a consequence of mining. I don't know if you're aware of the situation, familiar with the situation of these two disasters that happened in a period of 4 years. And up to this day, none of the people who were forced out of their homes have a new home. And many of them are dying. They didn't die when the press was broken. They also died because of contamination, because of their physical ails, because of a waste. And this is a strategy just not just to dispose, but also to lead people to death. It's even harsher, it's more harsh. And all of this has to go through a process of decolonization. Decolonization of the being, decolonization of knowledge, because we're ever stronger. No, we have more European powers, more and more European powers that are telling us how we should have fun, how we should live, And that implies the death of other ways of living, entertaining, etc. So that's why it's a little bit different from the Homo saced of Agamben. And it's a little bit closer to Aklimbembe, who is a very important person to think about, not just necropolitics, but also resistance. And I believe that resistant constructions will contribute. And this is something that I think, because with this work with the people affected by mining, many of them in rural territories, and there are there is another way of life there. There's another lifestyle. And the economy there is not neoliberal, which is an economy of affections, an economy that makes you rethink life. And I think it's extremely resistant. So sometimes we think that we need to rebuild new resistances. These resistances exist. Maybe not in the big centers, the big urban centers. But if we start putting our feet on the ground and waking people up, making people aware from the original populations, then we can learn to re-exist. It's not just to resist, it's to re-exist. We have to build a new existence. That's it. It's to unlearn those subjections. We have to unlearn that subjection. Exactly. To unlearn and learn in a specific way.
Bueno, Patricia quiere hablar.
Okay, Patricia wants to speak. Okay, Patricia, please, you have the floor. Thank you very much. I'm really thankful to be here, really glad to be here. I was a little late, but I believe that one of the things happening in Mexico is that we have a good example of resistance and autonomy in the original inhabitants of those areas. But however, in Mexico, there's been a media control, and through years they have focused on presenting the movement that woke up in 94, sorry, the revolutionary movement from 94, and presented. Okay, they decided to continue working autonomously and in resistance, and now they have examples of construction, and they have rebuilt health, they have rebuilt a new way of living, they have relearned, and they have returned to their territories and returned to their origin. However, the new liberal bombarding of media in the cities has presented them as people who are against progress, people who are against transformation. And this is being repeated in the present government once after another. This has increased violence in the Aboriginal territories. This has been the reason for displacement and for many paramilitary forces and groups that are killing them. And a lot of promotion for tourism, for mega projects, for the union with multinational companies, for mining, for gas extraction. And a lot of activists have been murdered, but it's been minimized. It hasn't permeated the media, the official media, only the autonomous and in resistant media. Most of the people, the vast majority of society, think that these people are against progress, against the work for everybody. And this production of entrepreneurs, which I call predators because they are actually self-depredating, eating themselves. So we must be very humble and start seeing another kind of resistance and not always be looking up to the north. Totally. Well, if you allow me to dialogue a little bit with Patricia, we're going through exactly the same process in Brazil, but at least a little bit the government of Bolsonaro We have a government. I mean, let me talk about him for a while. He has as an education, as the Ministry of Education, somebody who is against public education. He has as the Minister of Environment, somebody who is in favor of building presses and mining and invading Aboriginal lands. We had a series of murders of Aboriginal leaders during these pandemics. So basically, all of us in Latin America are going through a very similar situation. I believe that despite the fact that these violence are established in each of these countries, they have been able to achieve more than we have. For example, we cannot occupy properties. For example, we have been attempted against, I mean, leaders in Colombia have been attempted against more than in other countries. Supposedly during pandemics, none of this would happen, but it's when more of them have been murdered. So we have to learn a lot more from these other Latin American countries so that we can establish these resistance movements. Because actually there is no other alternative, there is no other way but resistance. That's the only way we can achieve something, because otherwise capitalism will have its way. And we, as subjects of these spaces and scenarios, our time is running out. So we have to start planting the seeds in those who are coming behind us, after us, so that, okay, they can strengthen being brothers in knowledge. Thank you for inviting me.
Todo lo que tanto Karine como Jhon han traído a colación me parece que nutre mucho el, vamos a llamarlo,
Everything that we have heard today, I believe, nurtures a lot the soil in which we will
cómo
sow
construir o cómo
the
hacer
seeds of how to beat, how to fight, how to
en las
resist,
ciudades donde hay
how
una
to
tendencia
struggle in cities
la
where
segregación
there is such a big
funciona y
tendency to
funciona
segregation,
no
to
solo
exclusion,
desde la mano del Estado,
discrimination,
sino
not
también
only by the
desde
state,
la
but also made
mano de las
legitimate by the
organizaciones y las
state
corporaciones, ¿no? Patricia nos
in
decía
the
que,
hands
por
of other
ejemplo,
actors like
las
multinational companies
ministras
and mining
de
companies.
TV
For
Azteca
example,
o
the Minister of Education in
Televisoras,
Mexico was a,
presidentes.
president of TV
Entonces,
Azteca,
como que
and
las
then
cosas
Macri in
son
Argentina, he became
diferentes.
president, and then
No,
we're
sí,
very
definitivamente
surprised
hay unos
because
intereses
definitely there
económicos
are economic
que
interests,
pueden
hidden economic interests
o que definitivamente están
that are
transformando
transforming
nuestros territorios y eso
our
contribuyendo
territories and
y
excluding,
teniendo una afectación más fuerte sobre personas históricamente
and they
excluidas
have a
y
negative
excluyéndolos
impact
también a
on
los que tal
people
vez
who
en
have been
otros momentos hemos
historically
sido excluidos,
neglected.
porque esto no
And
es una, no es como
also those of us who feel
nada
neglected, who have been historically neglected. This is like nothingness of Michael Ende in the never ending story. Remember, nothingness is expanding and expanding, and you believe that it will never hit you, but at some point it comes to you, it gets to you.
no estamos tarde,
So,
pero
right
es
now,
urgente
well, it's not late,
empezar este trabajo
it's not
y
too late, but it's
reconocernos
important to start
como
working
sujetos de
on this
derechos
direction
y
and
no
start
como
recognizing
sujetos
ourselves
de nuestra propia
as subjects of rights
nuestra propia
and not as entrepreneurs of our
responsabilidad.
own company. And I think that's something
Yo los
very
invito
important.
entonces a todos los que están
So
conectados
I
aquí en
invite
Zoom
all of
y a
you,
través de nuestras redes
everyone who's
sociales,
participating and
por
connecting through our social
continuar.
networks here at Zoom
Segundo,
and through our
paso,
social networks,
quiero
please
invitarles a
continue
diálogo.
with us,
Cuando uno dice derecho a la ciudad, no
because when we
solamente
talk about
significa eso, ¿no?
right
Y
to
a
the
veces cuando
city,
nos sentamos a
we
hablar,
don't understand exactly what it
hablamos
means. But
de
after
San
we sit
Pedro,
down,
reducción de
and
daños,
when we talk
y
about a
hablamos
drug
de
use,
organización
reduction of
urbana,
damage,
hablamos
urban planning,
de territorios y la
territories,
relación de los
bodies, and
territorios
their
y la
body
capacidad
territory relationship,
de
and the relationship
segregación,
between art,
gentrificación,
entrepreneurship,
se van dando
gentrification,
cuenta que somos
segregation,
lo que
that
es la
we
constante
realize that this is a
vulneración de los derechos de la
constant,
ciudad y que debemos construir una
constant
ciudad
violation to the right of
segura.
this to the
Entonces,
city,
pues,
and we must resist, all of
esta,
us.
esta tarde,
So
ahorita
this afternoon,
en una hora, si no estoy
Within an hour,
¿sí? Tenemos la conferencia sobre COVID
we have
y
a
ciudad.
conference on
Y
COVID
es una
and city,
conferencia
which is a
que me pareció
conference
muy
that
importante meter,
we considered very
incluir
important to
el tema del
include
COVID, porque pues
because
realmente el COVID y
really,
el
because
aislamiento,
actually
el
isolation and
miedo
COVID and
tanto
fear
a
and
la
panic
contagio también se
to
volvieron
contagion have become
herramientas de
tools
segregación,
for segregation, for
discriminación, como
discrimination,
hablábamos ayer en nuestra
manipulation.
reunión de
What
catarsis,
we spoke
¿no?
yesterday in our
Hicieron que
catharsis
se
reunion,
precarizaran los servicios, cada vez lleguen
this
menos,
made services
los
precarious.
servicios de salud se
Health
restringieron,
services were
¿no? Y
restricted.
todo, y no, al final no
In
sabemos
the end, we
qué
have
es lo
no
que
idea
pasó
what else
para
could
adelante y
happen
cómo eso
from now on.
transformó
And since
realmente
it
las sociedades
transformed our
y las
society
ciudades.
per se
Entonces vamos a
and
tener
our cities, then
para
we're going to
esta
have for this
conferencia a
conference
Andrés Hidárraga,
Andres Hidárraga,
que ha venido trabajando
who
desde
has been
Bogotá
working from Bogota
diferentes procesos de
and has been
acción
working on
colectiva y
different social
ciudadana
processes of
para apropiarse y
citizen
movilizarse
integration,
en
collective
relación
integration,
a la
okay,
prevención.
in relation to the
Sí vamos a
prevention.
tener a Teresa Williamson,
And we will also
que
have
ella
Teresa
es
Williamson,
norteamericana, pero
uh,
tiene muchos
North
años trabajando en
American,
Río de Janeiro
but she's been
y
working for
ella
many years
coordinó
in Rio
muchas
de Janeiro,
organizaciones
and she
y
has
desarrolló
coordinated with many
el panel
organizations.
COVID de favelas, que es
Okay, and
una herramienta
the
para
COVID panel for
muestreo,
favelas, which is
muestreo
a
del
tool
impacto del
for
COVID
counting,
real y no
measuring
manipulada por
of
el Estado.
COVID in favelas that is
Entonces,
real and
dando
not
unos pasos,
manipulated by the
esto es
government. Now,
como
this
un
is
mapeo que se hace desde
an
las favelas,
actual
desde las
mapping
comunidades, cómo se
conducted
tiene
from
que
the inside, from
establecer
within the
las
favelas.
acciones
She's going to
y
explain to us how
cómo
she
vamos a
built
apoyar
it, how she did
a
it,
las personas que
how it
viven en zonas
works,
periféricas a
and how
través
it has
de la
serviced
pandemia y a todas
the
las
people who live in favelas.
soluciones alrededor de la pandemia, que
It's
son las noticias
benefited people who
falsas,
live in
el
the
fake
favelas,
news, el
and how the fake
aislamiento,
news and panic and fear,
la segregación,
segregation,
el aislamiento, la
and
prohibición
isolation
al
and prohibition
trabajo,
to work,
que no es el trabajo estable, ¿no?
which is
Sino
not the
también
stable
son
work.
los vendedores ambulantes, cómo se
And it's not
volvieron
only a stable
personas
employment,
que no
also
podían salir a
vendors.
trabajar,
And they were the ones who
los que no
could
tenían
not
acceso a
be able to
trabajo
work.
físico.
They did not have access to their
Teresa
work.
nos va a dar un poco esa
So
perspectiva.
Teresa will
Entonces, pues los invitamos a
talk about
todos
this
a que vuelvan y se conecten
on her
y
presentation.
podamos seguir
So please
colectivamente
connect again
construyendo
so that
sociedades
we
y
can continue to
ciudades
build
más
societies
justas y
and
más
cities
seguras para
more
todos y para
inclusive and
siempre.
fair for everyone. Karine, thank you so much.
Increíble. John, muchísimas gracias.
John, thank
Un
you so
abrazo muy
much.
grande y muy fuerte para ustedes. Como le decía a Carl y a Raquel ayer, ojalá el próximo año nos podamos
Just
encontrar otra
everybody,
vez.
thank you so much.
Esa es
I wish we
nuestra
can meet
intención.
all again next year. That's our
Muchas
dream.
gracias. Fue un gran placer
Thank you so
estar
much. It
con
was a
nosotros y también
great pleasure to be here
conocernos
with you and to
todos.
meet you, those of you I
Muchas
didn't know
gracias, John.
before.
John,
Thank you.
una palabra final.
John, any final words? Any final comments?
Estás muteado.
You're muted, John. But for me, it's a pleasure to be with you and to share this scenario, to learn from those other perspectives and that invitation for those other resistant movements. Let us continue walking on that direction. Let us continue to multiply. Thank you so much.
Bienvenidos siempre, bienvenidos a todos.
You're
Y un
always
saludo para
welcome.
los que
Everyone's
están
always
conectados
welcome.
desde diferentes barrios
And
de Latin
greetings for
America.
people who are
Nos
connected
vemos
in
ahora.
through
Muchas
different cities
gracias.
of
Chao,
Latin
chao.
America. Bye bye. Thank you so much.